The Electoral College was a check on the rights of ordinary people to directly elect the president, as well as a guarantee that Presidents George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe would protect their fellow Virginia plantation owners' interests in the first decades of the nation's history. Shortly after ratification of the Constitution in 1779, Congress passed the Naturalization Act of 1790, which restricted the naturalization process towards citizenship in the United States to, quote, any alien being a free white person, quote, end quote. The Constitution and the Naturalization Act marginalized people of color for generations to come. The racialization and denial of citizenship to entire classes of workers became the blunt instrument that employers used to keep wages low in numerous occupations identified with undesirable African American and later immigrant labor. The Naturalization Act worked to exclude non-white people from the benefits of citizenship, even and entrenched racism as the philosophy of westward expansion. Thomas Law, Washington's first rich man, explained to James Madison that racialized naturalization was a necessary weapon of settler colonialism. Quote, I conceive that Virginia should particularly adopt every method to introduce more whites and, if possible, to diminish the blacks. If immigrants were fixed to the westward, they would not combat against Indians and Negroes. End quote. The making of emancipatory internationalism. As the embers of the Revolutionary Age died out, African Americans sought to rekindle the visions of liberation that had animated them in earlier decades. The historian Julius Scott notes that the next great sparks of liberty in the Americas came from the Caribbean. In 1791, enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, a famously profitable sugar colony of France on the island of Hispaniola, carried out an extraordinary insurrection. The uprising was inspired in part by the French Revolution. Some of its leaders had served with the Chasseurs Volontaires de Couleur de Saint-Domingue in support of the American Revolution years earlier. History's only successful slave revolution was led by Toussaint Louverture, a former house servant. The slaves defeated each of the European armies sent to crush their rebellion. Winning their independence in 1804, the revolutionaries christened their new nation Haiti in honor of the original indigenous inhabitants' name for the island, Haiti, much to the horror of U.S. and European slave owners. As African Americans quickly understood, and as historians have reconfirmed, the Haitian Revolution was a major impetus for the abolition of slavery and independence in the Americas. African Americans throughout the United States commemorated the Haitian Revolution in many ways. Black newspapers featured stories on the drama, and parents taught their children about the valiant Toussaint Louverture, as well as his generals Dessalines and Christophe. Black communities named streets and neighborhoods after revolutionary Haitian heroes. Students at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia were required to learn and to recite Jean-Jacques Dessalines' quote, 1804 Independence Address to the Haitians, end quote. African American slaves in Virginia and North Carolina organized revolts between 1800 and 1801 that drew on the Haitian and French revolutions for inspiration, end quote. Bibliography citations. African American and Latinx History of the United States, Beacon Press, 2018.